So I came up with a name for today's presentation, making the case for creative placemaking just last week. So sorry, that kind of quite snazzy title didn't appear on your Eventbrite detail for today. So I was really enjoyed listening to what Gillian was saying, and actually something you mentioned just in passing was data equals relevance. I think that's kind of a really important thing to think about, is that if you can glean data and collect data, that actually that creates a relevance for what goes after and what happens. In terms of Leith and Leith Creative, we're interested in placemaking, but not placemaking for the few, but placemaking for everyone who is in a place, making places more humane, but providing creative ways of making spaces more humane for everyone to engage and enjoy with them. So I'm not sure if everyone knows much about Leith. It's great to have had Leith being suggested that it might be a city this morning already. It is maybe a republic. Leith is an area of Edinburgh, a very unique area. It's the dock area of Edinburgh. It's got a population of around 25,000 people. And it has a really creative reputation, partly because creatives like myself have been doing things in Leith for some time now. And the Leith Creative collaboration, as it is, was began as a cultural mapping project between myself, who also runs an event or festival called Leith Late, and my colleague Duncan Bremner, who runs an organisation called Citizen Curator. And we were very aware of all this kind of focus of concentration and interest in Leith as being an area that was very creative, but kind of trying to dissect a little bit what that meant. What is Leith Creative at all? So we started our partnership in 2015 and produced a booklet. I've only got a few of these, Understanding Leith's Cultural Resources and Creative Industries. And as a result, what we were doing, we were really asking, is Leith creative? But fundamentally asking people what they think. I suppose we were kind of presuming that the answer was yes. What do you think makes Leith creative? Talking about barriers to creativity in Leith, and what individuals thought would make Leith more creative. And as a result of our 6-month engagement, we were speaking to creative hubs in the area. We were also speaking to other cultural assets and the resources, reaching out to individual artists and creatives, and also speaking to actually kind of big data organisations such as Cultural Republic. It's quite an interesting little segment on the information that we gleaned actually from Cultural Republic over that period. So Cultural Republic take all the audience data from box offices in the creative industries across Scotland, and they were really interested in the work that we were doing as part of this project, and we're happy to kind of to suck data, and also share the data that they'd got on box offices. So out of that is a kind of a little aside, which is really interesting, is that we found out that EH 6 and 7 postcodes, which are Leith postcodes, were in the top 5 for, I need to think of a better term for this, but for cultural consumption in Scotland. So we were able to say that actually not only potentially was Leith very creative in terms of the amount of artists and organisations that were in it, but also in terms of cultural consumption, Leith was right up there and above the national average. So we produced a map. It was a cultural mapping exercise after all. So this is a map just that denotes the kind of spatial spread of Leith's creative hubs, assets and festivals. So I identified 9 creative hubs throughout that, spoke to each of the hub heads. Again, I still haven't got a better word for that. And the local festivals. And we also spoke to over 200 individual creatives to see what their views were. And we produced a lovely infographic as part of that, as well as the report. With some really interesting and important data that came from some of the most pertinent ones for us were things like 2/3 of the 9 hubs that we'd spoken to did not have security of tenure on their premises. Of the individual creatives that we were speaking to, over 1/3 of those were working from home. And we were also able to start actually talking about numbers. So the 9 Leith hubs that we spoke to were providing 564 studio or desk spaces, and approximately 1,148 creatives were working from these spaces. So immediately this is starting to generate figures and numbers, and stuff that becomes a little bit more pertinent when you're speaking to policymakers. How many people that the Leith festivals were employing on a voluntary basis, as opposed to how many were actually getting paid for the work that they did. How many people that Leith festivals were attracting on an annual basis to Leith. It was over 45,000 people. Really big numbers. And also, in addition to the map and the infographic, we also, as I say, produced this report, which included 5 additional recommendations that came directly from the responses to our survey and from our research. For example, if with the Cultural Public data, we can say that residents in Leith are some of the biggest cultural consumers in Scotland, why isn't there a dedicated cultural space in Leith? So you can start to make the case for the next steps. Okay, so fast forward to 2017. So we produced that report, and we kind of wanted to kind of take things further and actually not just be speaking to the cultural community and the creative community about itself, but engage with the wider community. So we got a bit of funding from the Scottish Government's Design Charrette fund. It's an interesting word, design charrette. It kind of means co-design. So bringing the community together to design how they want the future of their area to be seen. So the main thrust with this was to engage with as many people in the Leith area who either lived or worked in the area with these questions. Basically looking at identifying assets, challenges, and asking what steps individuals would take to make Leith better. So this was a 7th-month project, and we actually carried out 18 pop-up events over a 3-month period, which was quite shocking for me when I realised that we'd done that much in a short space of time. And the pop-up events were actually working with 3 different creative agencies who had developed different methods for engaging with people, and also it's a way of kind of generating data that isn't just a kind of dry survey, though there was a dry survey at the back of everything, because again, this is hard data. So we had over 1,000 people engaging with those activities, and 750 people, or just under 750 people, filled out the survey. So this is a map, another map. So, yeah, we had just under 750 survey respondents. There's just 568 Leith postcodes reflected on the map. Again, this was a nice little exercise that we did when we'd got quite far down the process and had achieved a lot of surveys, because we were really anxious that the responses that we were getting were as reflective of as wide a amount of the community as possible. So we were actually really happy with the spread. There was a slight kind of gap around Restalrig, but there was also reasons for that, and we had worked in Restalrig as well. A lot of people in Restalrig just don't feel that they're part of Leith or in Leith, though they're kind of mucked in as well. We also looked at the demographic data from people that had chosen to give us the demographic data, which is on the side here. And again, we were happily pleased that the demographic data that came back to us was broadly in line with the census data for Leith as well. And it was also interesting to look at the kind of breakdown of who was living, working, or both living and working in the area. So, number one, we wanted to identify assets. I've put this word cluster up in the background just as a little bit of an illustration. It's not actually, I think word clusters are a little bit reductive, because they literally just tell you how many times one word or one phrase has been used. So what we started doing was, we were getting obviously hundreds of responses, but was to code these responses, and they were kind of text boxes, so people could write as much as they wanted, but coding these responses into themes and categories, and you could have as many themes or categories per response, depending on how much someone had come back to us with. And then from that, we were looking at kind of frequency of responses. So then you could see if the most mentioned categories. In this case, finally, our key assets that we were able to identify as a result in order of importance were number one, people and community. You can see there's kind of an element of that there in that word cluster. Services and facilities, diversity, which is also connected with the kind of identification of the community as well. Environment and amenities, and creativity and culture. I was really happy that creativity came out. Obviously, we've got creative in our name. We're running the survey. Maybe, you know, we're speaking to some folk, but yeah, some really nice little notes to creative and Leith in there. And in the same way, we were also doing this with identifying our challenges. So the key challenges identified from this section was improving local environment and amenities, housing, regeneration, connecting the community, and governance and systems. Now there was other categories that are quite pertinent and also kind of appear almost in this word cluster to a certain extent. So things like crime, antisocial behaviour, poverty was things that were kind of up there but not in that top 5, and we thought it was really important to try and just focus on the key challenges and assets. From there we could then look at action areas and how we can actually address some of these. So as I suppose an amalgamation of looking at challenges and how those challenges could be addressed in light of the assets that had been identified. We came up with these 5 key action areas. And then if you have a little look at the blueprint, you can also see that we've then broken these action areas further down, again using and utilising these recurring suggestions from respondents on each kind of thematic. And it was all around this question of what would you do to make Leith better. Interestingly, it was quite difficult to try and get folk to really think about individual agency. Some things such as public assets and affordability are out with not just the jurisdiction of everyday citizens, but also of Leith Creative. So there was some work, I think, and then that also comes into kind of local democracy empowerment, encouraging people to feel that they have ownership, agency and control over what happens in their local areas. So I'll show you how this works actually. Now I've got a little, you can't really see the map, but I've put one of these in every table. I've got a few extras, sorry, I wasn't sure who was going to come along, but it kind of opens up like a map. And lo, there was a map. So on the back, we've got the assets and challenges, the action areas and the conclusions. And then on the inside here. So this was just the best way we could come up with to distill all of the information that we'd gathered over this 7-month period into a clear and understandable set of key priorities and focus for action going forward. So we've obviously got a list of the key action points, I should have said assets and challenges there. We've also got a bit of information about the further engagement data that we'd gleaned from the 3 engagement methods with our agencies, and also we conducted a community conference as well. We also came up with an additional 8 key recommendations that again were down to frequency of occurrence, and came up with those final conclusions. Now, this is very, very recent. So it was published in October 2017, so just the end of last year, and it's already had quite a lot of positive impact. So the blueprint has now been incorporated into the North East Locality Plan, which interestingly enough, from a document produced by the City of Edinburgh Council, had absolutely no mention of culture or creativity in it before we spoke to them. It's also been included in the Leith Docks Development Framework Review, which is underway at the moment as well, and it's also given a focus for some of the local participatory budgeting activities by the local community councils called Leith Chooses. They've actually taken our action areas and used them as ways that that groups in the area can address those action areas with pots of money, which is great. And going forward, we want to kind of build on our existing data. There was originally, when we first applied to the Design Charrette Fund, there was a fund by the Scottish Government called Activating Ideas, which was then kind of subsumed into itself with the charrettes and has become called the Making Places Fund. We applied to that just at the very end of October while we were also writing this, so it was slightly fraught, but luckily we were successful, and we're also looking for match funding at the moment as well, to really kind of bolster a programme of activity in 2018. So we want to build on our existing data. We want to address the key points raised by our research to date. We want to really kind of drill down into those action areas and see some actual interventions and differences happening on the ground. For example, a very basic one we identified through our recommendations of the police blueprint is that there was no seating from Elm Row to the Kirkgate along the length of Leith Walk. Leith Walk is one of the longest streets in Edinburgh. I think the only other one is the Royal Mile. But there was nowhere that you could actually sit in the whole of that length without making some kind of financial transaction by going to a cafe or otherwise. So we'd be interested in trying to kind of address some of the issues through us by creating rapid prototyping. Maybe let's try and put some benches out on Leith Walk and see what happens. Let's try and use cultural events and to address some of the areas that we've looked at in our maps, and ways to kind of bring the community together and talk about community empowerment and local democracy. And going even further forward, we could start to look at the development of a People's Place plan for Leith. The Scottish Government at the moment is very interested in, again, this kind of bottom-up local democracy and communities developing their own local place plans. We're interested in trying to prototype that and see what that actually means. Can Leith create its own local place plan collectively with the community, and how does that look? So that's our plans for 2018. I think that's me. You can have a little look at both of the reports that I mentioned on the Leith Creative website. You can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And yeah, thanks very much.